Come join me on the Erk Hofheinz ancestry trip to Indiana and Ohio. On this trip, we will be visiting my direct maternal ancestors from Eleanor Erk Pearson, that died in 2019, to Hannah DeLay Hull, who died in 1817. They founded with their family Cincinnati and Miamisburg, Ohio. Our direct maternal ancestors followed our mother's maternal ancestry branch that consists entirely of women. That means my mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, second great-grandmother, and so on. We will also be stopping to visit other ancestors along our way that are not direct maternal ancestors on this visit, that are in the same cemeteries. The full round trip is about 110 miles, starting and finishing in Richmond, Indiana. I have included stories and facts along the way in this video. This road trip takes 4 to 6 hours depending on how long each gravesite is visited. However, this video will take about 10 minutes. First, we'll be heading to Versailles, Ohio to visit my 7th generation direct maternal ancestors who founded Cincinnati and Miamisburg. Her name was Hannah DeLay Hull, and she died in 1817. To get there, take Highway 121 through New Madison and then other country roads until you get to Green Lawn Cemetery on the west side of Versailles, Ohio. Hannah DeLay Hull, who died in 1817, and her husband, Zachariah Hull, who died in 1822, are buried here, presumably next to their children in the old area on the west side of the graveyard. Hannah is my 7th generation direct maternal mother. Hannah and Zachariah was the first settlers in Cincinnati, and they founded Miamisburg, Ohio, with the first civilization outpost called Hull Station. It details how they were the first pioneers on the American Westward Front after American Revolutionary War. Hannah and Zachariah were married in 1774 in the Smoky Mountains, 35 miles west of Winchester, Virginia. The Revolutionary War of 1775 through 1783 was just in its beginning phase, and Zachariah took arms up against the British. At that time, the Smoky Mountains were the border of the American colonies and as far west as civilization has expanded. Going west any further, pioneers would be attacked by Native Americans who were defending their hunting grounds. After the American Revolutionary War in 1783, pioneers started moving beyond the colonial frontier as opportunity overrides the fear of Native American attacks. They migrated west of the Smoky Mountains into Ohio and Kentucky using the Ohio River to navigate their journey. The Ohio River starts in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and ends at the Mississippi River in northwest Kentucky. One such family who took the journey down the Ohio River was Hannah and Zachariah, and their 5 children, including 3 of Zachariah's brothers. They were the first settlers of LaSanceville, and what is now named Cincinnati. They built the first station on the Ohio River banks, where today's right field of the Cincinnati Great American Ballpark stands. They did this in 1788 to protect their families from Native American attacks. A year later, Fort Washington was built next to their station, and Cincinnati was a chartered town in 1802. But before Cincinnati became a town, Hannah and Zachariah decided to take their family up the Great Miami River in 1797 to settle a new community known as Hull Station, where Miamisburg is today. The Greenville Treaty, signed in 1795 with the Native Americans, opened up new lands to settlers. So Hannah and Zachariah's family continued to move north, and they settled a farm near Versailles, Ohio, where they had additional 2 children and lived the rest of their lives and were buried there. Versailles, Ohio is just south of the Greenville Treaty line. Further north in that time was Indian Territory. It is interesting to think of the land where Hannah and Zachariah lived. While the land was relatively flat, it was full of thickets and forests that needed to be cleared for farming. Why the whole family left Hull Station that they founded to venture north 50 miles to Versailles, Ohio, it's not written. However, land opportunity after the Greenville Treaty was signed of inexpensive, fertile, virgin land could have been one reason. The Greenville Treaty was signed at Fort Greenville, now called Greenville, Ohio, on August 3, 1795, following the Native American loss at the Battle of Fallen Timbers a year earlier. It ended the Northwest Indian War in the Ohio country, limited Indian country to northwestern Ohio, and began the practice of annual payments following the land concessions. The parties to the treaties were a coalition of Native American tribes known as the Western Confederacy and the United States government represented by General Anthony Wayne and some local frontiersmen. The treaty became synonymous with the end of the frontier in that part of the Northwest Territory that would become the new state of Ohio. While at the Green Lawn Cemetery, we'll find their grave sites and look at the memorials that are there. Next, we travel 17 miles west to Hillgrove Cemetery that is located about 3 miles southeast of Union City, Ohio, on Road 571. We visit Hannah and Zacharias Hull's daughter's gravesite. Her name was Hannah M. Hull, and her husband's name was Brandon. She is my 6th generation direct maternal mother, named after her mother. She's buried next to James Brandon, who died in 1876, and they share the same gravestone. Hannah and James were married when she was 26 years old, and they had 6 children, one of them being Mariah, who is my 5th generation direct maternal mother. As with most of the people in those days, they were farmers. They bought 160 acres of land from the U.S. government in 1820, which is known at the time as the territory northwest of Ohio and above the mouth of the Kentucky River. The reason their farm is 17 miles west of their parents' farm is settlers' children needed farms when they married, and areas west of Versailles were not settled at the time. Hillgrove is a very small cemetery on the corner of 571 and Pickett Road. Hannah raised their family on their farm, with Mariah Brandon Teeter, who died in 1910, being one of their daughters and my direct maternal mother. The gravestone for Hannah is smaller than it appears. Next, we travel 7 miles east of Union City to the old Tea Garden Cemetery to visit Mariah Brandon Teeter, who died in 1910, and her husband John Paul Teeter, who died in 1891, gravesite. Their graves are on the west side of the church and with a large Teeter flagstone. It's hard to miss. Mariah is the daughter of Hannah M. Hull Brandon and my 5th generation direct maternal mother. Mariah and John had 9 children together, one of them being daughter Amanda Teeter. They were farmers all their lives and likely attended the Tea Garden Church in front of the graveyard. In that time, all farming was done with horses, as there were no tractors. The 9 children they had went on to settle other farms in the area, and one of them, Amanda, moved to a growing and bustling town of Richmond, Indiana. Next, as you go south out of Union City on 227 towards Richmond, stop by the Hoover Cemetery that is 4 miles south. Here you will visit the Watson family gravesites, who are also our ancestors, however, a non-direct maternal branch. David Watson II, who died in 1910, and his wife Mary, who died in 1892, and David Watson I, who died in 1850, and wife Flora Graham Watson, who died in 1885, are buried here at the Hoover Cemetery. The Watson family immigrated from Scotland, Flora did, and Ireland, where David Watson did. Flora Watson has an interesting story about dancing with the captain to tell you when she came over on the boat. Flora is likely the person we get our Scandinavian DNA, as the Argyll area of western Scotland, where she came from, is where Scandinavians settled. The Watsons are the only non-German ancestors in my family, with their ancestors coming from Scotland, Ireland, and England. My mother's DNA ancestry is made up of 68% German, 11% Scandinavian, and 8% British and Irish. The Scandinavian, British, and Irish all come from the Watson family. David Watson died 28 years before his wife, Amanda, of a heart attack while delivering buttercream to Schultz Saloon on Northeast Street in Richmond. Amanda afterwards lived as a maid servant to another family as she outlived her children, Betsy, who died at 36 years old of an infection after she cut her hand on a glass jar, and Grace, who is my direct third maternal ancestor, who died when she was 40 years old. Amanda and David are buried in Section 6 of the Earlham Graveyard, near the lower part of the hill. Next, we visit Erk Hofheinz, who died in 1948, gravesite. It's at the Lutheran Cemetery just south of Richmond, Indiana. His wife is my third-generation direct maternal mother, Grace Watson Hofheinz, who is buried near Tallahassee, Florida, at the Florida State Hospital in an unmarked grave. You can read Grace's story in My Great-Grandparents' Journey, written by Tom Pearson, and the Chapter 1 tells the story of her life. Ernest and Grace's daughter was Edith Hofheinz, who is my second-generation direct maternal mother. Ernest is buried next to his father, Christian Hofheinz, who died in 1916, and his mother, Caroline Hofheinz, who died in 1918. Both of them immigrated from Germany in 1866, right after the American Civil War. Next, we visit Edith Hofheinz Erk, who died in 1949, and her husband, Walter Erk, who died in 1954, at the Lutheran Cemetery. They're buried very close to the Hofheinz. Edith is my second-generation direct maternal mother and my grandmother. Minnie Luke Erk, who died in 1954, and William Erk, who died in 1950, were Walter Erk's parents, and they are buried in another section of the cemetery. Also buried is another section near the front of the cemetery is Walter's great-grandparents, who immigrated from Germany in 1866. Herman Erk, who died in 1896, and Dorothy Erk, who died in 1918. My second-generation direct maternal mother, Edith Hofheinz Erk, had 3 daughters. Her oldest was Eleanor Hofheinz Erk, who is my first-generation direct mother. Next, we visit Eliza Weaver Luker grave in the Lutheran Cemetery in Section 3 of the Lutheran Cemetery. She is my second great-grandmother. However, she's not my direct maternal mother. Her grave is next to her mother and father's grave, John and Susanna Weaver. They are my third great-grandmother and grandfather. As she died an early death just after her first child, Minnie, who died in 1954, and she is my great-grandmother. Minnie's father, Charles Luke. Next, we visit Eliza Weaver Luker's husband's grave at Crown Hill Cemetery in Centerville. His name is Charles Luker. He is buried with his second wife. Charles outlived 3 of his wives, and he lived to 96 years old. He immigrated from Germany when he was 2 years old. He is my second great-grandfather. He is buried in the old cemetery area in Section 3, near the front, with his second wife, Lizzie. Next, we travel to Goshen Cemetery, where Eleanor Erk Pearson, who died in 2019, and her husband, John Pearson, who died in 2012, are buried. It's 1 mile north of Whitewater, and their farm was on Highway 227. You will pass it as you drive to Goshen Cemetery. They are my mother and father. To learn more about them, please also read My Great-Grandparents' Journey by Tom Pearson. Hannah DeLay Hull and Zachariah Hull were pioneers. Hannah and Zachariah and their families were among the first settlers in Lisanceville Station that is now called Cincinnati. Hannah DeLay Hull, her husband Zachariah Hull, and his brothers erected an outpost civilization in 1789 that is located just behind right field of the Cincinnati baseball stadium. When the Revolutionary War of 1775 through 1783 was over, the undeveloped Ohio country was an American territory. Like many veterans of the war, Virginian Zachariah Hull brought his family over the mountains into the wilderness north of Kentucky. By January of 1789, the founders of Cincinnati had completed their surveys and plot maps. Among the first few families to buy their land was that of Zachariah and Hannah Hull and their first 5 children. Other people with Hannah and Zachariah were Zachariah's brother Daniel, John, and William. The whole clan made up a large part of the Cincinnati's civilization population in 1789. They pooled together their resources, labor, and land to construct Lisanceville Station among the hardwood forest along the banks of the Ohio River, where now sits the Cincinnati Reds baseball stadium. A station was a wooden stockade built to house several families until it was safe to go out and establish individual homesteads. At the same time, on a hill a few hundred yards away, the new U.S. government was building Fort Washington, a major regional army base on the Ohio River. While the British had withdrawn after the Revolutionary War, they were still encouraging Indian raids on settlers and outposts throughout the Ohio country. Braves under Chief Blue Jacket of the Shawnee and Chief Little Turtle of the Miami tribe were concerned about the future of their hunting grounds. In June of 1791, John Von Cleve, a blacksmith at Fort Washington, was stabbed and killed and scalped less than a mile from Lisanceville Station. Until the victory at the Battle of the Fallen Timbers in 1794 and the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, it was unsafe for individual families to settle far from the forts. By 1797, Zachariah and Hannah had left the protection of Fort Washington to go up the Miami River and establish Hull Station on the future site of Miamisburg, Ohio. They were the first settlers of Miamisburg 220 years ago when they built Hull Station. Stations were stockades that they lived in, fearing harm from the Native Americans. However, Native Americans proved to be friendly, and more settlers joined them at Hull Station to what became Miamisburg. In 1797, the area around what would become Miamisburg, Ohio, was a wilderness. In that year, Zachariah and Hannah DeLay Hull and their family trekked north 40 miles from the frontier village of Cincinnati and the protection of Fort Washington to build a collection of log cabins within a wooden stockade that became known as Hull Station. You can read about it on the internet at the miamisburg.org website. It reads, about 1797, Zachariah Hull came with his family. He built a stockade on the east bank of the Miami River opposite the mouth of Bear Creek. He found that the Native Americans were friendly. To the stockade came squatters, surveying parties, and settlers, mostly from Pennsylvania, who had taken out grants and lived there until their own cabins were completed. Hence, the small community came to be known as Hull Station. Hannah's father, James DeLay, died a year after she was born on the North Virginia frontier in 1752. A few years later, what is now Hampshire's County, West Virginia, was almost depopulated due to heavy raids during the French and Indian War. By 1774, a grown-up Hannah married Zachariah Hull in a nearby Loudoun County, West Virginia, where the family settled. Zachariah joined Patriot Virginia forces during the Revolutionary War, and by 1789, the family was among the first to settle Cincinnati in the territory northwest of the River Ohio, where, along the Zacharias brothers, they helped to establish Lisanceville Station on the riverfront. From there, it was up the Miami River to create Hull Station, a welcome sight for travelers and settlers for many years. A station was a defensible, privately owned stockade. It contained one or more log cabins and barns with a wooden fence around it, embracing enough ground to shelter several families. Here's a correspondence of John Cleves Sims, founder of the Miami Purchase with Hull. Zachariah and Hannah lived in today's Miamisburg until at least 1806, and most likely much later. Their children saw opportunities near Versailles, Ohio, where they bought land from the government for their farms. In their older ages, they moved to Versailles with their sons, William and James, and where they are buried now. Hannah died in 1817 at the age of 65, and her husband, Zachariah, died in 1822 at the age of 70, and will forever be known as the founders of Miamisburg, Ohio.